At some point in Christian history, a word changed its function. She continued to be theological. It remained biblical. It continued to appear in debates about truth, doctrine, and fidelity. But he started doing something more. She started tagging people. Today, when someone hears the word Antichrist, they almost always imagine a monumental figure, a final enemy, a presence that synthesizes deception, opposition to God, and historical threat. It's a powerful image. But this image did not fall into the Christian imagination. It was built, and over the centuries, this construction gained a function that went beyond the interpretation of texts. It began to organize conflicts. This means that at many points in history, calling someone the Antichrist was not just a theological statement. It was also a gesture of positioning. One way to say, here is the error that threatens everything we are. It may just seem like strong rhetoric, but words with this weight rarely work just as a description. They create borders. When a concept begins to carry the idea of absolute opposition, not just disagreement, but essential corruption, it ceases to operate solely as an analysis. It begins to operate as a marker of identity and exclusion. Throughout Christian history, few terms have carried this potential as strongly as Antichrist. And that raises a question that rarely comes up when the topic comes up in popular conversations about the end times. The question is not just who the Antichrist would be. The question is, before that, when did this word begin to function as a label for historical adversaries? Because if we go back to the origin of the term, the scenario is very different from the modern imagination. The term does not appear in political treatises. He is not born as a geopolitical figure. It does not initially appear as a world leader, economic system, or ultimate empire. It appears within a much more localized dispute, a dispute about truth, teaching, and belonging within Christian communities. This does not diminish the weight of the word, but its framing changes, and this is where the story starts to get more complex than it seems. Because once a word enters the religious vocabulary with the ability to identify the gravest possible error, the kind of error that threatens faith itself, it acquires extraordinary potential. It can continue to be used for theological discernment, but it can also be used for something different, to completely delegitimize the opponent. Throughout history, this has happened more than once. Theologians applied the term to ideas they considered dangerous. Religious movements applied the term to rival institutions. Spiritual leaders applied the term to authority figures they believed to be corrupt. At certain times, the label even circulated in conflicts that mixed theology, politics, and the dispute for legitimacy. And when that happens, something interesting happens to language itself. The concept no longer functions only as an interpretation of a text. It becomes a way of framing the conflict. Instead of discussing just arguments, the debate starts to revolve around something bigger. Not just error, but historic threat. Not just disagreement, but radical opposition. This type of language has a curious effect. It simplifies. She concentrates. It transforms complex debates into very clear moral narratives. On the one hand, loyalty. On the other, corruption. On the one hand, true. On the other, deception. Of course, Christian history was never limited to these simplifications. Theological debates have always been much denser than isolated labels can capture. But the presence of a label like Antichrist alters the climate of any discussion, because it doesn't just describe a specific error. It suggests something much broader. It suggests that the opponent represents a type of threat that goes beyond normal debate. And it is exactly at this point that the investigation of this episode begins, not to decide who was right in each controversy, nor to reduce the concept to a mere rhetorical instrument, but to understand how a word with biblical origins came to circulate in Christian history with such great symbolic force. To do this, we need to go back to the beginning, when the term appears for the first time in the text. There, the scenario is more restrained than many subsequent readings suggest, but it also already contains the elements that would allow, centuries later, a surprising expansion. It may seem like a small detail, one word among many others, but it is precisely there that the trajectory of a concept that would go through theological disputes, institutional conflicts, and religious crises begins. And perhaps the most interesting question is not just how the term has been interpreted, but why have so many different eras felt the need to apply it again? Because when a word spans centuries being reused to name the most dangerous adversary imaginable, that tells us something not just about theology. It says something about how communities deal with threat, identity, and conflict. And it is exactly this path that we are going to rebuild now. But before looking back at the centuries of dispute, we need to start with something much smaller. The place where the term really was born, in the text, and more specifically, in a context that was far from imagining the importance that this word would gain in history. When the term Antichrist first appears in the New Testament, it appears in a very specific environment. It is not a broad eschatological treatise. It is not a speech about future empires, nor is it a description of a world leader who would emerge at the end of history. The word appears in the Johannine letters, especially in 1 John and 2 John. And there, the scenario is narrower, more pastoral, and much more linked to internal conflicts than the modern imagination usually assumes. The author writes for Christian communities that were already facing doctrinal tensions. This is not about direct imperial persecution, nor about a global political crisis. The problem is another. Some teachers and groups were promoting teachings that, in the community's assessment, distorted central elements of the Christian faith. The text describes a rupture. People who were previously within the community now appear as bearers of teaching that is considered misleading. It is in this environment that the word emerges, not as a grand title, but as a category of discernment. In 1 John 2:18, for example, a phrase appears that often goes unnoticed when the term is read only in light of later interpretations. Just as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have arisen. The construction of the sentence is revealing. It recognizes an already existing expectation, the idea of a future Antichrist, but immediately moves it to the present. Instead of just pointing to a distant eschatological character, the text states that many Antichrists were already active at that time. This observation changes the framing of the word. It does not just function as a description of a future event. It works as a diagnosis of a present reality. And the criteria used by the author are not political, geographic, or military. It's theological. In the letters, The central problem involves the denial of fundamental elements linked to Jesus' identity. The dispute revolves around Christological confessions, who Jesus is, what his incarnation means, and what constitutes fidelity to the apostolic message. In this context, Antichrist does not describe a ruler, describes a type of teaching, or, more precisely, people who propagated this teaching. The term functions almost as a marker of doctrinal opposition, someone who stands against the central truth proclaimed by the community. That doesn't make the term light, quite the contrary. The word carries significant weight. It identifies a type of deception considered serious enough to threaten the integrity of faith. But still, the scenario remains relatively localized. We are facing a communal conflict, an internal debate about truth, error, and fidelity. The term does not yet appear as a dominant figure in a global eschatological narrative, nor as a symbol of the story's final enemy. This difference is important because it shows that the concept is smaller and more contextualized than many subsequent readings assume, which does not mean that the word was doomed to remain that way. In fact, the text itself contains elements that would allow for future expansion. The reference to a previous expectation, "You have heard that the Antichrist is coming," suggests that the idea of a final concentrated opposition was already circulating among Christians, a figure or a force that would represent the height of deception. But the author does not develop this scenario. It shifts attention to the present, for what was already happening within the communities. And this is where an interpretative tension arises that would span centuries. Does the word describe only specific first-century deviants? Or can it be applied to any form of opposition that reproduces the same pattern of deception? This question is not directly answered in the text, but the very formulation of the concept leaves this possibility open. Because when speaking of many antichrists, the author does not restrict the category to a single individual. It presents a type of phenomenon, a pattern of opposition. This creates a curious effect. The term is not tied to a single historical event. It becomes reapplicable. Any situation in which someone denies what the community considers central could, in principle, be framed within the same logic. It is clear that the author of the letter was dealing with a concrete conflict of his own time, but the language he uses has an elasticity that would later allow for much broader uses. And this is a crucial point for understanding what would happen in the following centuries. Because the word Antichrist in CEE within a specific theological debate, but it is born with a characteristic that few categories have. It combines two very strong dimensions. First, the idea of direct opposition to Christ. Second, the idea of active deception within the community. This combination produces an extremely powerful category. Whoever is identified within it is not just wrong. It is associated with a form of opposition considered fundamental, and it is precisely this symbolic power that would make the term so attractive in later disputes. But this has not yet happened at this point in the text. Here, the term remains embedded in a pastoral setting. A community trying to protect its understanding of faith in the face of teachings it deemed dangerous. Nothing yet indicates that this word would become, throughout history, one of the most loaded labels in Christian religious language. However, there is a detail at this point that deserves attention, because, although the term was born within a localized conflict, It touches on something much larger. He touches on the question of the frontier of truth. And whenever religious communities need to define this border, the language tends to gain intensity. It is at this point that categories of discernment begin to carry broader implications. And going through centuries of theological debates, institutional disputes, and confessional conflicts, the term Antichrist would find new scenarios to be reinterpreted. But before reaching these more turbulent historical moments, something important still needed to happen. The word needed to leave the immediate environment of the Johannine letters. It needed to enter the broader field of Christian interpretation of apocalyptic texts. Because once the concept began to dialogue with other biblical figures associated with deception, persecution, and eschatological evil, its trajectory would no longer be just local. She would start to connect with a much larger imaginary. And it is precisely at this point that the history of interpretation begins to open up in different directions. Some readings have kept the term close to its original context. Others began to expand their possibilities. And it is at this intersection of readings that the next stage of the story begins to take shape. When the term Antichrist began to circulate beyond the immediate context of the Johannine letters, something predictable happened. He entered the broader field of Christian interpretation of Scripture, and in this environment, a concept rarely remains isolated. Different texts begin to dialogue, images begin to come closer, and little by little, what was born in a specific scenario starts to be read within a much larger picture. That's exactly what happened. In the first centuries of Christianity, interpreters began to realize that the New Testament had several passages that spoke about deception, opposition, and figures associated with the final conflict of history. Among these passages were, for example, the man of lawlessness mentioned in 2 Thessalonians, the images of the beast in the book of Revelation, and diverse traditions about persecution, apostasy, and eschatological deception. Initially, these texts did not form a single system. They belonged to different genres, had different contexts, and presented different literary functions. But when interpreters began to look at them together, an almost inevitable question arose. Do these figures describe different phenomena or aspects of the same enemy? This question opened up a huge field of interpretation. Some early Christian authors preferred to maintain a certain distinction between these images. Others began to approach them. And when this rapprochement happened, the concept of Antichrist began to gain new weight. The term that originally identified doctrinal opponents within the Christian community began to be associated with a broader eschatological figure, a final opponent, a concentrated presence of deception and opposition. This merger did not happen immediately or uniformly. It was gradual, and it occurred amid theological debates, biblical comments, and reflections on the meaning of history in the light of the Scriptures. It may seem like just an interpretative adjustment, but in practice, this change profoundly alters the scope of the concept, because when the Antichrist begins to be read in connection with other apocalyptic images, it stops being just a diagnosis of doctrinal error. He comes to be seen as the maximum expression of opposition to Christ in history. This is where Christian imagery begins to broaden the term. Some interpreters go on to describe him as a future figure, Others emphasize its relationship to persecution, religious deception, or spiritual corruption. And there are also those who explore the idea that the Antichrist would represent a combination of these dimensions. It is not difficult to understand why this expansion happened. The Christian communities of the first centuries lived in a world marked by urges, political stability, religious disputes, and profound cultural changes. In this scenario, texts that talked about deception, false teachers, and opposition to the gospel gained practical relevance. The question was not just theoretical, it was historic. How can we recognize forces that threaten fidelity to faith? And in certain contexts, the idea of concentrated opposition helped organize this perception. But there is an important detail in this process. Even when interpreters began to associate the Antichrist with other eschatological figures, there was no immediate consensus on how these connections should work. Some authors understood the Antichrist mainly as a future leader. Others saw the phenomenon as something that could manifest itself repeatedly throughout history. There were also readings that emphasized the spiritual aspect of deception more than the figure of a specific character. In other words, the concept was still in motion. It had not yet developed into the relatively consolidated portrait that many later traditions would convey. And it is precisely during this period that something curious happens to language. When different biblical images begin to be brought together, they produce an effect of symbolic accumulation. Each text brings its own dramatic charge. Each figure adds a new element to the picture. The result is a progressively more intense image of the eschatological adversary. Opposition to Christ is no longer just a localized doctrinal problem. It comes to be imagined as a historical force capable of deceiving, persecuting, and destabilizing faith on a large scale. And with this expansion, the term Antichrist gained something that it did not have so much force before. It becomes a point of convergence, a place where different narratives about evil, deceit, and ultimate opposition begin to meet. It may seem like just a theological reorganization, but the consequences of this movement are profound, because the more images accumulate around a concept, the more powerful it becomes as a public language. A term that brings together multiple dimensions: deception, persecution, spiritual corruption, eschatological threat, begins to carry enormous weight when applied to any concrete situation. And this opens up a possibility that was not yet fully in evidence. If the Antichrist represents the most concentrated form of opposition to Christ, so identifying someone or some institution with this category means assigning this adversary the most serious role imaginable within the Christian narrative. At this point in history, this possibility was still being explored primarily within theological interpretation. But the ground was already prepared, because the fusion of biblical images had transformed the concept. It was no longer just a word used in pastoral letters to identify deviants within a community. It had become part of a broader eschatological vocabulary, a vocabulary capable of describing not just specific errors, but conflicts that seem to threaten the very course of the history of faith. And when concepts with this type of density enter periods of intense dispute, something almost inevitable happens. They no longer function solely as interpretation tools. They also begin to function as instruments for framing the conflict. But this stage is yet to come. Before the term Antichrist becomes a label applied to concrete historical adversaries, we need to observe another aspect of his trajectory. We need to understand how certain words come to operate as mechanisms of exclusion within religious communities. Because it is at this point, when theological language begins to define social boundaries, that the concept takes on a new dimension. And that's exactly where the next part of the story becomes even more revealing. When a religious concept gains sufficient density, it begins to do something beyond interpreting texts. He begins to organize borders. This happens in virtually every religious tradition throughout history. Communities that form around a common conviction inevitably need to answer a delicate question. Who is within this conviction, and who is no longer? At first, these distinctions often arise in relatively specific theological debates, discussions about language, doctrine, interpretation of texts. But as time passes, certain words begin to condense these debates into much quicker forms of identification. They become shortcuts. Instead of repeating the entire argument, the label already communicates the conclusion. Within Christian history, the term Antichrist gradually began to assume this type of function, not instantly, and certainly not in all contexts. But as the concept became connected to the broader eschatological imaginary, its ability to mark boundaries became ever greater. Because few words can bring together so many implications at the same time. It doesn't just point to error. It suggests direct opposition to what the community considers central. And this difference is decisive. A theological disagreement can be debated. A mistake can be corrected. But when a concept carries the idea of radical opposition to the truth, the effect is different. The person or group identified with this label is no longer just a mistaken interlocutor. It is now seen as carrying a structural threat. This type of language produces something that sociologists of religion often observe in contexts of communal tension. It creates an intensified otherness. In other words, the opponent is not just different. It represents a type of difference that seems incompatible with the very continuity of the community. At this point, theological language also begins to operate as a social language. Naming becomes a way of framing. When someone receives a loaded label like Antichrist, the debate changes scale. It's no longer just about examining an argument. What is at stake is the legitimacy of the agent who presents this argument. In other words, the dispute is no longer just about ideas. It also becomes about belonging. And this profoundly changes the climate of any controversy, because once a community begins to identify certain positions as signs of radical opposition, the room for negotiation diminishes. The opponent is not only perceived as someone who interprets the text differently. He can be perceived as someone who threatens the integrity of the faith. This displacement does not necessarily occur consciously. Rarely does anyone explicitly state, "Let's turn this concept into a tool for exclusion." The process is more gradual. It happens when certain terms begin to concentrate, in a single word, all the moral weight of a dispute. And in this sense, the concept of Antichrist has a particular characteristic. It combines two dimensions that, when united, produce an extremely strong effect. First, it points to deep religious deception. Second, it suggests active opposition to the person of Christ. When these two dimensions appear together, the label does not just describe an error. He describes a type of antagonism that seems irreconcilable. That is why, throughout history, words with this type of structure often appear in moments of institutional crisis or intense conflict. When communities face disputes that threaten their unity, the temptation to use absolute categories increases. These categories offer something that complex debates rarely offer with such clarity: moral simplicity. On the one hand, loyalty. On the other, corruption. On the one hand, true. On the other, deception. Of course, historical reality almost never fits so perfectly into these schemes. Christian controversies, when observed closely, are marked by sophisticated arguments, interpretative disputes, and real differences in reading the Scriptures. But strong labels have a peculiar ability to reorganize public perception of these disputes. They simplify the landscape. They reduce complexity. They create a narrative in which the main issue already seems resolved before the full debate even takes place. And this is exactly why concepts with a strong eschatological charge end up acquiring so much power in periods of tension, because they allow you to interpret conflict not just as disagreement, but as part of a much larger drama, a drama involving truth, deception, and the fate of faith itself. When this framework is established, the label stops being just a word within an argument. He starts to function as a field marker, a way to quickly identify who belongs to which side of the dispute. This does not mean that all historical uses of the term Antichrist had this intention. Often, the concept continued to be used in contexts of theological reflection or biblical interpretation. But as the term circulated in increasingly intense debates, its ability to operate as a language of exclusion became more evident. And when this possibility enters the scene, something new begins to happen. The concept is no longer just an analysis tool. He becomes an active player in his own controversies. In other words, the Word begins to participate in the dispute. And it is at this point that the history of the term enters particularly revealing territory, because going through centuries of Christian debates, the label Antichrist would begin to appear in increasingly unexpected places, not just in discussions about heresy or false teaching, but also in disputes between Christian movements, institutions, and religious leaders. At certain times, the word would be applied to specific opponents, real people, royal authorities. And when that happens, the language definitely stops the abstract field of interpretation. She enters the arena of history. Up to this point in history, the concept of Antichrist had already undergone two important transformations. First, it had emerged in the Johannine letters as a category linked to doctrinal discernment within Christian communities. Then, as it entered the broader interpretative tradition, it had begun to dialogue with other eschatological images: the man of lawlessness, the apocalyptic figures of deception and opposition, and the expectation of a final conflict between truth and error. These two layers already greatly expanded the scope of the term, but a decisive step was still missing: the moment when the word would stop circulating mainly within biblical interpretation and would start to appear at the center of concrete historical controversies. And that is exactly what began to happen as Christianity went through periods of intense dispute. In the early centuries, doctrinal debates over the nature of Christ, the authority of apostolic tradition, and the interpretation of Scripture produced deep divisions within Christian communities. These controversies were not just abstract discussions. They involved ecclesiastical authority, community identity, and in many cases, the very survival of certain movements within the church. In this environment, strong concepts began to play a strategic role. When a group considered that a particular teaching compromised essential elements of the faith, the vocabulary used to describe it often took on increasingly intense tones. The term Antichrist appears occasionally in this type of language, not as a systematic definition applied to all opponents, but as an extreme expression of theological rejection. He indicated that the problem was not just a difference in interpretation. It was something perceived as a threat to the integrity of the Christian faith. But the real leap in the historical use of the label would come later. As Christianity expanded and became institutionalized, new forms of dispute began to emerge. Not just doctrinal debates, but also conflicts between centers of religious authority, competing interpretations of Scripture, and disputes over legitimacy and leadership. And in contexts like this, words loaded with symbolic weight rarely remain neutral. They begin to circulate as instruments of criticism and accusation. During the Middle Ages, for example, eschatological interpretations began to associate the figure of the Antichrist with expectations about the end of history and the emergence of concentrated opposition to faith. These readings coexisted with the patristic tradition and with the interpretation of Scripture that had developed over the centuries. But at the same time, they provided a powerful language for interpreting religious and institutional crises. Whenever a deep conflict over authority or corruption arose, the eschatological question reappeared. Would this be the type of opposition announced in the Scriptures? Most of the time, this question remained at the level of theological reflection. But at some moments in Christian history, it began to be applied in a much more direct way, and few periods illustrate this as clearly as the 16th century. During the Reformation, tensions between different interpretations of the Christian faith reached a degree of intensity rarely seen before. Debates over biblical authority, tradition, sacraments, and church structure deeply divided the European Christian world. In this scenario, the language used by the different sides of the conflict has become increasingly blunt. Some reformers began to interpret certain ecclesiastical structures and authorities as historical manifestations of the opposition described in the Scriptures. In certain controversial texts, the label Antichrist appears associated with institutions that, in the view of these authors, had moved away from fidelity to the gospel. On the other side, leaders linked to the Catholic tradition responded with equally harsh criticism, describing reform movements as serious threats to the unity and orthodoxy of the Church. The word Antichrist was not the only one used in these disputes, but its presence reveals something important. It shows that the concept had already gained enough traction to condense extremely broad accusations into a single image. When this label appeared, it didn't just point to a specific era. He suggested that the adversary represented a historical form of radical opposition to the Christian faith. This type of language has a powerful effect in conflict contexts. It transforms complex disputes into eschatological narratives. The debate is no longer just about practices or interpretations. It comes to be perceived as part of a larger struggle between loyalty and corruption. And once this type of framework is established, the concept itself takes on a new life. It is no longer just a term inherited from the interpreter biblical action. It becomes a tool of symbolic mobilization. Over the following centuries, this pattern would continue to appear in different religious contexts. Disputed moves would apply the label to opponents they considered dangerous. Preachers and polemicists would resort to apocalyptic language to interpret crises of their own time, and in many cases, the concept of Antichrist would function as the most concentrated form of theological accusation possible. But there is a curious detail in this process. The label became effective precisely because it brought together several dimensions in a single word: doctrinal mistake, moral corruption, historical threat, spiritual opposition. All this could be suggested when the term appeared, and perhaps that is exactly why the concept has survived so strongly throughout history. Not because he always identified the same phenomenon with precision, but because it offered a language capable of transforming the adversary into a symbol of absolute error. At this point, the term had come a long way since its origins in the Johannine letters. But there is still a decisive moment in this trajectory to be seen, the moment when this transformation becomes clearly visible, when the concept definitively stops being just a theological category under debate and starts to operate as a symbolic weapon in the public space. And it is exactly at this point in history that we find the most important turning point in the evolution of this label. So far, the trajectory of the term Antichrist already reveals a gradual process of expansion. The concept arises in a specific pastoral context in the Johannine letters. Then it enters the interpretative tradition of the ancient church, where it begins to dialogue with other eschatological images. Later, it appears occasionally in theological controversies, especially when doctrinal disputes reach more intense levels. But still, for much of this history, the term remains mainly within the realm of theological interpretation. It can be used in harsh criticism. It can appear in eschatological reflections. It can serve as strong language within debates about orthodoxy, but it has not yet consistently become a public language of institutional delegitimization. This change begins to become visible in a very specific period of Christian history, the beginning of European religious modernity. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, the Western Christian world entered a phase of turbulence that would profoundly alter its structures. Crises of authority, political tensions, cultural changes, and the emergence of new theological currents created an environment in which the religious unity that had marked much of the Middle Ages began to fragment. In this scenario, debates that previously circulated within relatively controlled spaces began to expand into the public field. Printed pamphlets, sermons, treatises, and disputes began to circulate with increasing rapidity. E, com essa circulação ampliada, a linguagem das controvérsias também se transformou. This is where the function of the concept of Antichrist undergoes a decisive inflection. It may just seem like rhetorical intensification, but in fact, we are facing a structural change in the way the word is used. Before this period, the category appeared mainly as part of interpretative discussions or eschatological expectations. Now it begins to be applied directly to concrete institutions, authorities, and religious systems. This change alters the status of the concept. It no longer functions merely as a description of theological phenomena. It starts to function as a totalizing historical accusation. During the disputes of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, different authors began to interpret the religious crisis of their own time in light of the eschatological narratives present in the Scriptures. For some reformers, certain ecclesiastical structures had moved so far away from the gospel that they could be understood as historical manifestations of the opposition described in biblical texts. In this context, the figure of the Antichrist came to be associated not only with individuals, but with entire systems of religious authority. On the other side of the conflict, theologians linked to the Catholic tradition responded with equally severe criticism. Reform movements were often described as agents of division, doctrinal error, and a threat to the continuity of the Church. Although the exact vocabulary varied, the tone of the accusations revealed something important. Each side began to interpret the opponent as carrying a type of danger that went beyond simple theological disagreement. It may seem like a small detail, but this is where the story changes direction. Because when an eschatological concept begins to be applied to real institutions in contemporary disputes, it stops being just an expectation about the future. He starts to organize the reading of the present, and that completely changes the dynamic ICA of language. From that moment on, calling the adversary the Antichrist does not just mean suggesting that he is wrong. It means asserting that it represents a fundamental historical opposition to the very heart of the Christian faith. This statement has enormous consequences. First, because it redefines the conflict. The dispute is no longer just about biblical interpretation or religious practice. It comes to be perceived as part of an eschatological drama. Second, because it turns the label into a mobilization tool. If the adversary embodies a historical form of radical opposition to the faith, then resisting him is no longer just a theological preference. It becomes a moral imperative. And this explains why this change was widely accepted in certain contexts. The period was marked by institutional uncertainty, religious fragmentation, and an intense dispute for legitimacy. In such environments, narratives that offer moral clarity and comprehensive explanations for conflict often find great resonance. The concept of Antichrist provided just this kind of language. It allowed us to interpret profound historical transformations as part of a much larger struggle between loyalty and corruption. But this turn also had another consequence. It greatly expanded the reusability of the concept. Once the label began to function as a public instrument of delegitimization, it became available for new applications in different contexts. The word was no longer restricted to exegetical debates. She had definitively entered the arena of religious and political disputes. And this raises an interesting question. What would have happened if the interpretative trajectory had followed a different path? If the concept had remained more restricted to its original context, linked mainly to doctrinal discernment within communities, perhaps it would not have become one of the most powerful labels in Christian controversies. But the story took another direction. The fusion of eschatological images, added to the institutional crises of religious modernity, transformed the term into something much broader. From that point on, the concept of Antichrist was not just a category inherited from biblical interpretation. It had become a language capable of reorganizing entire conflicts. And once this language entered public circulation, its impact went beyond the strictly theological field. She went on to touch something deeper, something linked to the way human beings interpret threat, error, and absolute opposition. And that is precisely where the investigation needs to take another step. Because to understand why this label continues to appear throughout history, it is not enough to just look at texts or controversies. It is also necessary to look at the psychology of the absolute enemy. After the historical turn that transformed the concept of Antichrist into a public language of conflict, something interesting begins to appear when we look at the following centuries. The term keeps coming back. It reappears in different contexts, in different disputes, in times that do not share exactly the same theological or institutional problems, but the pattern repeats itself. Whenever a religious community faces an adversary perceived as deeply threatening, the temptation to resort to absolute categories returns. And this doesn't just happen for theological reasons. There is also a human factor involved. The way people and communities deal with conflict is rarely purely analytical. It involves emotions, threat perception, and the need to protect collective identity. When a group feels that something central is being put at risk, be it the truth of the faith, the integrity of the tradition, or the legitimacy of its institutions, the way it describes the adversary tends to intensify. This process is known in several areas of human sciences. Historians of religion, sociologists, and social psychologists often observe that, in contexts of strong tension, communities begin to organize the conflict in simpler and more absolute terms. The opponent is no longer just someone with whom you disagree. It comes to be interpreted as the incarnation of a much larger problem. And here appears a fundamental characteristic of the concept of Antichrist. It offers exactly this kind of language, a language that allows you to condense several dimensions of threat into a single figure: doctrinal error, spiritual deception, moral corruption, historical threat. All of this can be suggested when the word appears. It may seem exaggerated, but from a psychological point of view, this type of simplification has a very clear function. He transforms complex situations into understandable narratives. Instead of dealing with multiple layers of conflict, political, theological, institutional, the community begins to see the scenario in more direct terms. On the one hand, loyalty. On the other, deception. This type of narrative offers something that periods of crisis rarely provide easily: emotional clarity. And that is precisely why concepts associated with absolute evil have so much longevity in religious history. They function as interpretative structures capable of organizing the experience of conflict. But there is another important element in this process. When an adversary is described in absolute terms, the room for ambiguity decreases dramatically. Complex debates typically require time, nuance, and a willingness to examine competing arguments. Extreme labels operate differently. They condense the conclusion even before the entire argument process takes place. And this profoundly changes the dynamics of the confrontation, because once someone is associated with a category like Antichrist, the debate rarely continues on the same level. The question is no longer simply whether the interpretation is correct or not. It becomes whether the adversary represents a fundamental threat to the faith. This change of scale has a powerful effect. It transforms interpretative disputes into existential conflicts, and existential conflicts tend to mobilize communities much more intensely. This is why the concept of Antichrist continued to appear at such different moments in Christian history. Not necessarily because all contexts shared the same eschatological interpretations, but because the symbolic structure of the concept responds to something profoundly human: the need to identify and name the ultimate enemy. This need appears in many religious traditions and also in political and cultural contexts. Societies often construct narratives that focus evil on specific figures or systems. These narratives offer a way of interpreting chaos and organizing collective action. In the case of the Christian tradition, eschatological vocabulary provided a particularly powerful repertoire for this type of symbolic construction. Among these categories, few have proven to be as versatile as the concept of Antichrist, because it combines two things that rarely appear together with such force: a recognized textual basis within the Scriptures. It is a symbolic structure capable of adapting to very different historical contexts. This combination explains why the label has survived for centuries. It has not remained identical in all eras. Its meaning was reinterpreted, expanded, and adjusted as new disputes arose. But the basic symbolic function remained recognizable. Identify the opponent who appears to represent the most radical form of opposition to what the community considers to be true. It may seem like we are just describing a phenomenon from the past, but perhaps the most uncomfortable question is something else. Does the tendency to transform complex conflicts into absolute narratives really belong only to history? Or does it continue to be part of the way human communities, religious or not, deal with what they perceive as a threat? Because when we look closely, we realize that the pattern has not disappeared. It just takes on new forms. And it is precisely this historical repetition that leads us to the last step of the investigation: the time to observe how the concept has been consolidated over the centuries and why it continues to be available in the modern imagination. When we observe the entire historical trajectory of the concept of Antichrist, one characteristic begins to stand out quite clearly. The idea did not remain tied to the context in which it emerged. She went through very different times. It has survived profound theological changes. It went through institutional transformations within Christianity. It appeared in moments of crisis, in doctrinal disputes, and also in conflicts that mixed religion, authority, and power. And whenever it reappears, the concept seems to fulfill a very specific function. It helps transform an opponent into the ultimate symbol of opposition. This pattern did not arise from a single theological decision. It was formed gradually. First, when the term left the pastoral environment of the Johannine letters and began to circulate within the Christian interpretative tradition. Later, when interpreters began to bring the Antichrist closer to other biblical images associated with deception and final conflict. Later, when intense historical disputes were discovered, this word possessed an unusual ability to condense broad accusations into a single expression. Each step expanded the scope of the concept a little, and in doing so, it also expanded its symbolic availability. This is an important point. Some ideas remain restricted to the theological field in which they arise. Others end up becoming much broader interpretative tools. The concept of Antichrist followed the second path. It has become reusable. This means that throughout history, different movements and communities have been able to apply the label to opponents who they consider dangerous to the faith. Not always with the same meaning, not always with the same intensity, but always using the same basic structure. The idea that the conflict in question was not just a common disagreement. It was something that represented a fundamental opposition to the very heart of the Christian faith. This type of language has enormous strength within religious traditions because it doesn't just describe a problem, it reorganizes the entire narrative of the conflict. When the opponent is framed within such a loaded eschatological category, the debate begins to be perceived within a much greater drama. Not just a theological discussion, but it starts from a story that involves truth, deception, and the destiny of faith. Over the centuries, this framework has appeared at different moments in Christian history, in disputes about doctrine, in institutional crises, in confessional conflicts that divided entire communities. The label Antichrist was not used in the same way in all these contexts, but the operating pattern is recognizable. The word appears when the conflict reaches a level where one of the parties begins to perceive the opponent as not just mistaken, but as a representative of absolute danger. And it is precisely this structure that explains the permanence of the concept in the modern imagination. Because the contemporary world still inherits many elements of the religious language formed throughout Christian history. Even when theological debates are not explicitly at stake, apocalyptic vocabulary continues to exert influence on the way some communities interpret crises and historical changes. In certain contexts, the figure of the Antichrist still appears as a way of explaining phenomena that seem to threaten fundamental values. In others, the term appears in religious discourses that attempt to interpret cultural or political transformations within an eschatological framework. These applications do not always follow exactly the same interpretative lines developed in previous centuries, but they reveal something important. The concept remains available. It remains within the symbolic repertoire of the Christian tradition. And this happens because throughout history, the Word has learned to do something that few concepts can. She learned to cross different contexts without losing her dramatic strength. This ability to adapt explains why the label continued to be reapplied in such different scenarios. The same word that emerged in a doctrinal conflict located in the first century ended up becoming part of medieval theological debates, modern confessional disputes, and contemporary interpretations about the direction of history. But this trajectory also reveals something deeper. It shows that religious ideas do not circulate simply as interpretations of texts. They also participate in how communities understand threat, allegiance, and identity. The concept of Antichrist has not remained relevant just because of its biblical origins. It has remained relevant because it has encountered throughout history situations in which its symbolic structure seemed to make sense, situations in which complex conflicts were reinterpreted as manifestations of a larger opposition, situations in which communities felt the need to name what they perceived as the greatest danger to the faith. And it is at this point that the investigation of this episode finds its conclusion, not in an attempt to identify who, throughout history, correctly or incorrectly applied the label. But in understanding something different, the historical trajectory of an idea that was born in a specific context of Scripture, entered into interpretative debates over the centuries, and ended up becoming one of the most loaded categories in Christian religious language. When reconstructing this path, something becomes clear. The concept that many people today receive as a fixed definition did not emerge ready-made. He went through disputes. It has been reinterpreted in different contexts, and it gained strength precisely when it stopped functioning only as a theological description and began to operate as a language of conflict. In other words, more than explaining a character from the end of time, the history of this concept reveals something about the trajectory of ideas within the Christian tradition. It shows how certain words spanned centuries, accumulating meanings, functions, and interpretative layers, and in doing so, they end up shaping the way entire generations imagine the drama between truth and deception in history.